The day John Farnham buried his heart with his son. The funeral that broke Australia. On a grey morning that would be etched into the collective memory of a nation, John Farnham stood before a small casket. His voice, the voice that had once filled stadiums, now reduced to a whisper. This is the story of a father's unimaginable loss, a tragedy that united millions in grief, and the moment Australia wept as one. Before we begin, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories like this one. The rain began before dawn on that Tuesday in late autumn. It fell softly at first, then with increasing persistence, as though the sky itself was mourning. In the suburbs of Melbourne, where neat Victorian homes lined quiet streets, the Farnham household had not slept. The lights had remained on throughout the night, casting pale rectangles onto the wet pavement outside. Inside, John Farnham sat in his son's bedroom, unchanged since the accident 5 days earlier. Robert's room was a 13-year-old's universe. Posters of cricketers on the walls, a guitar propped in the corner that John had given him for his last birthday, school books scattered across a desk beside a half-finished essay about his father's music career. John held one of Robert's jumpers to his face, breathing in the scent that still clung to the fabric. Grass, boyish sweat, and the faint trace of the cologne Robert had started experimenting with, trying to seem older than his years. Gillian, John's wife, appeared in the doorway. Her eyes were hollow, rimmed with the kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot cure. "The cars are here," she said, her voice barely audible. John nodded but did not move. He looked at her, and in that exchange, no words were necessary. They were parents who had lost their child, and no language exists adequate to that particular devastation. The accident had been senseless, as all such tragedies are. Robert and 3 friends had been walking home from football practice, cutting through a park they'd traversed 1,000 times before. A driver, later found to be under the influence, had mounted the curb at high speed. Robert had pushed one friend to safety before the impact. The other 2 boys suffered injuries, but survived. Robert did not. Australia had learned of the tragedy within hours. John Farnham was not just a singer. He was woven into the fabric of the nation's identity. His voice had been the soundtrack to weddings, road trips, moments of joy and heartbreak for millions. When news broke that his teenage son had died a hero's death, the country collectively gasped. Flowers began appearing outside the Farnham home immediately, mountains of them, along with cards, teddy bears, and handwritten notes from strangers who felt they knew John through his music. The funeral was to be held at St. Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne's CBD. The family had initially wanted something private, intimate, but the outpouring of public grief made it clear this was a moment that belonged to more than just them. The Premier of Victoria had offered a state funeral. John had declined. "He was our boy," John had said quietly. "Just our boy." The cathedral could hold 1,000 people. By 8 in the morning, 3 hours before the service, over 10,000 had gathered outside. They stood in the rain without complaint, many holding umbrellas printed with Australian flags, others clutching roses. A silence hung over the crowd, broken only by the sound of rain on fabric and the occasional sob. Inside the cathedral, John and Gillian arrived through a side entrance. John wore a dark suit that seemed to hang on him. He had not eaten properly in days. His face, usually animated and warm in public, was a mask of controlled anguish. Gillian walked beside him, one hand gripping his arm as though she might fall without that anchor. The casket sat at the front of the cathedral, impossibly small. It was covered in white roses, Robert's favourite, and atop it lay his cricket bat, signed by the Australian national team after Robert had met them at one of John's charity events. Seeing it, John's knees buckled slightly. Gillian tightened her grip, and somehow they continued forward. The cathedral filled slowly. Fellow musicians arrived, men and women whose careers had intersected with John's over the decades. They embraced him wordlessly. What could anyone say? Politicians came, including the Prime Minister, but they kept to the back, understanding this was not their moment. Robert's school friends filed in, teenage boys in ill-fitting suits, their faces stricken with a grief too large for their young hearts. Several were crying openly. At precisely 11 o'clock, the service began. A priest spoke of God's mysterious ways, of a young life filled with promise, of sacrifice and love. The words floated through the vast space, struggling to contain the magnitude of loss. Then came time for the eulogies. Gillian spoke first. She walked to the pulpit with trembling legs, a piece of paper clutched in her hand. When she began to speak, her voice cracked on the first word, Robert, and she had to pause, steadying herself against the wooden stand. Our son was sunshine, she said finally. From the moment he was born, he lit up every room. He had his father's music in him, but he also had something all his own, a kindness that came naturally. He never hesitated to help someone, even if it cost him something. And in the end, her voice broke entirely. She could not continue. Someone, a family friend, came to escort her gently back to her seat. If this story has moved you so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Then it was John's turn. The congregation held its breath as he rose. John Farnham had performed before millions, had commanded stages across the world with effortless confidence. But as he walked to the pulpit now, he looked like a man navigating a foreign landscape in the dark. He carried no notes. He gripped the edges of the pulpit and stared out at the sea of faces, some familiar, most not. Outside, the crowd of thousands stood in absolute silence, listening to the service broadcast through speakers. I don't know how to do this, John began, his voice rough. I've sung a lot of words in my life, written some, borrowed others, but none prepared me for this. He paused, and the silence stretched. Somewhere in the back, someone coughed softly. Robert used to tell me I was embarrassing. John continued, a ghost of a smile flickering across his face. When I'd sing around the house, he'd roll his eyes. Dad, please, and he'd say. But then I'd catch him humming the same songs when he thought I wasn't listening. He'd started writing his own music, did you know that? Many in the congregation did not. John pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. I found this in his room. He was working on a song, never finished it. The last line he wrote was, Dad says the music never dies. It just changes key. He was 13 years old and writing things like that. John's voice fractured. He pressed his fist to his mouth, trying to contain the sob rising from somewhere deep in his chest. The entire cathedral seemed to lean forward, as though collectively trying to hold him up. My son died saving his friend, John said when he could speak again. That's who he was. He didn't think, he just acted. And I am so proud of him, and so destroyed without him. The words hung in the air, raw and honest. John looked down at the small casket. I keep thinking about all the things he won't get to do, won't get to finish that song, won't fall in love, won't have his own kids, won't grow old, and it's not fair. It's not fair, and I'm angry, and I don't understand why this happened to him, to us, to anyone. Outside, the crowd wept openly. Grown men stood with tears streaming down their faces. Mothers held their children closer. The nation was breaking along with this father. But I also know, John continued, his voice steadier now, that Robert packed more goodness into 13 years than some people manage in 80. He made people laugh. He was loyal. He was brave. And in his last moment, he was heroic. That's a life, that's a real life, even if it was too short. John stepped back from the pulpit, then seemed to change his mind. He returned to the microphone. I'm going to sing something, he said. I haven't sung since it happened. Wasn't sure I could. But Robert would want me to. He'd roll his eyes, sure, but he'd want me to. There was a piano near the altar. John moved to it, sat on the bench, and placed his hands on the keys. The cathedral was so quiet that the creak of the bench seemed loud. He began to play a simple melody, nothing complex, just a series of chords. And then he sang. Not one of his famous songs, not a crowd favorite. Instead, he sang a lullaby, one he used to sing to Robert when he was a baby, the same one he'd sung when Robert was sick, when he couldn't sleep, when he needed comfort. John's voice, that magnificent instrument known to millions, was broken now, cracking on the high notes, wavering on the sustained ones. But it was the most honest performance of his life. He sang about stars and dreams and promises to keep a child safe. He sang about love that doesn't end even when life does. By the time he finished, there was not a dry eye in the cathedral. John sat at the piano for a long moment, hands still on the keys, head bowed. The burial took place at a private cemetery on the outskirts of Melbourne. Only family and close friends attended. The rain had stopped, leaving the world glistening and grey. As the small casket was lowered into the ground, John stood at the edge of the grave, Gillian beside him. Their other two children, Robert's younger brother and sister, clung to their parents. The finality of the moment was crushing. Earth began to fall on the casket, making a hollow sound that seemed to echo in John's chest. Someone later said they heard John whisper, "I'm burying my heart with you, son." Whether he truly said it, or whether it was the kind of story that grows around tragedy, it captured something essential about that moment. Part of John Farnham descended into that grave and never returned. Share this story if it touched you. It helps the channel immensely. In the weeks that followed, Australia mourned in its own way. Vigils were held in cities and towns. Robert's school established a scholarship in his name for students who exemplified courage and kindness. The driver who caused the accident was sentenced to 8 years in prison, though John and Gillian never attended the trial. "It won't bring him back," John told reporters who asked. "Nothing will." John did not perform for over a year. When he finally returned to the stage for a charity concert benefiting road safety initiatives, he was thinner, older-looking, his eyes carrying a permanent sadness. But before he sang, he spoke briefly to the audience. "Grief doesn't end," he said. "You don't get over it, you just learn to carry it. Some days it's heavier than others. But you carry it because the alternative is forgetting, and I will never forget my son. The music helps. It always has. Robert knew that. So I'm going to sing tonight, and I'm going to sing for him." The performance was transcendent, infused with a depth of emotion that only comes from profound loss. Critics called it the most powerful concert of his career. John never read the reviews. Years passed. The acute pain of those first days softened into a chronic ache, always present but manageable. John and Gillian established the Robert Farnham Foundation, dedicated to youth road safety and supporting families who had lost children. They spoke at schools, at government forums, anywhere they could turn their tragedy into something that might prevent another. On what would have been Robert's 21st birthday, John released a song he'd written about his son. It was spare and heartbreaking, just John's voice and a guitar. The same guitar he'd given Robert, now played in his memory. The song climbed to #1 on the Australian charts. Proceeds went entirely to the foundation. In interviews, John was always honest about his grief. "People expect you to be better after a certain time," he said in one. "But this isn't something you get better from. It's something you integrate. Robert is part of every day. I talk to him still. I tell him about his brother and sister, about his mum, about the world. I don't know if he hears me, but I need to believe he does." Gillian found solace in different ways. She returned to painting, something she'd abandoned years before. Her work became darker, more abstract, but also more honest. She held an exhibition titled After, and critics marveled at the raw emotion captured in color and form. She donated the proceeds to the foundation. The day of Robert's funeral became, in the Australian consciousness, a marker of collective grief, a moment when the nation paused and remembered that behind every tragedy is a family, a life, a story. John Farnham had given Australia decades of music, but on that grey morning, he gave them something more profound: permission to grieve, to acknowledge that some losses cannot be rationalised or overcome, only endured. In Melbourne's southeastern suburbs, there is now a small park named Robert Farnham Memorial Park. It has a playground, walking paths, and at its centre, a bronze statue of a teenage boy mid-stride, pushing someone to safety. Parents bring their children there, and sometimes, though not often, you might see an older couple sitting on a bench nearby, holding hands, watching the children play. The inscription on the statue's base reads simply, "In memory of Robert Farnham, who chose love over fear." We carry you forward, and Australia does carry him forward, as it carries all its lost children in memory, in changed laws, in parents who hold their kids tighter, in the knowledge that heroism looks like a 13-year-old boy making a split-second decision that defined his too short life. John Farnham never truly recovered. How could he? But he continued, singing, speaking, living, because that's what parents do after the unthinkable. They continue, not because the pain lessens, but because somewhere, in some way, they believe their children are watching, hoping they'll find the strength to take one more step, sing one more note, love one more day. The day John Farnham buried his heart with his son was the day Australia learned that some sorrows are too large for one person to bear alone. And so the nation bore it with him, in silence, in tears, in the shared understanding that love and loss are forever intertwined, and that the greatest performances are sometimes the ones we never wanted to give. Did this story move you? Comment below what you think happened next, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Your support means everything.